Cara Daggett is an assistant professor of political science at Virginia Tech. Her fascinating work on the histories of energy and within feminist political ecology is essential for understanding our age of accelerated planetary upheaval. In this conversation, she discusses how our current pandemic paradigm of considering the economy and well-being as two competing things really misses the fundamental fact that the economy, as conceived by capitalism, does not, and perhaps has never, served our well-being. The puzzle, however, that she poses here is, why don't we perceive it as such? Why, on both the left and the right, does the sacrifice of human and animal life to inaction and greed not trigger a deeper desire for a different system, or even, as she puts it in her award-winning book, The Birth of Energy, a new Earth that is not as easily taken for granted? Despite all of these indications that we are beyond repair, though, she also makes it clear that capitalism has not captured all of our relationships, and that other models of collective flourishing exist. So where do we look? In trying to model a means of communicating against powerlessness, Daggett offers a timely and historical reevaluation of the drive for dynamism that's existed since the 19th century, a drive to put the world to work that she exposes as the heart of so much suffering. Her work takes aim at the anthropocentric and often misogynistic roots of violence and outlines some of the ways that we can demand a healthier future with less work, more pleasure, and adequate abundance. I know you've done a few of these podcasts, Cultures of Energy, for example. You've appeared on that podcast. And I kind of actually wanted to start by asking you a question that came out of listening to you talk about your work on that podcast. You talk about how energy in biology is a question of thriving rather than a matter of just like moving matter around. And I thought that was really interesting. And you note that you felt like you didn't need to reinvent the wheel in advocating a certain kind of degrowth politics of, wider resilience, that there is this precedent in biology for a different model of thriving. And I know I'm kind of just jumping right into it here, but I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, this idea that there's an alternative model of flourishing that you find in biology.
Yeah, I think that gets to the heart of what I was trying to unpack in the book, which is that there are different ways that we have for calculating energy and using energy and thinking about energy, but um, we also have different ways of giving it value or meaning, like what is a good way to use energy. And I'm contesting the thermodynamic um, system in which it's about doing work, moving matter. I'm contesting it just as a universal description. And so, like you said, I'm looking at other possible, what you might think of as ends, the ends of energy use. And like you said, I mean, as soon as you start to think about organisms or life, it's obvious that moving matter is not the be all and end all, not just for humans, but for life itself. And thriving doesn't always mean moving matter. It also doesn't always. It's not always benefited by growth. Um, Cancer is obviously a good metaphor for growth that can be something harmful to organisms. So I wanted to although I didn't have time in the book to really go and explore in depth all these other scientific approaches to how energy gets used, I wanted to make sure to, like you said, note that it's not that we need some kind of new science of energy. Not only that, I think it's not that we even need to reinvent the wheel in terms of philosophy or theory, because there are lots of ways of life and cultures that have thought about energy differently.
Yeah, of course. And this is what I think is so interesting and so compelling about your book, is that it is providing this, um, really multi-layered history of energy that says, there is one model that has been normalized, right? And it is this then, deeply feminist book in the sense of trying to engage with the and reassess and defamiliarize these accepted notions of what counts as normal, what counts as the good a good sort of model of flourishing. And I think in my reading, especially as part of this feminist reading group that I've been participating in, I've noticed that a lot of feminist thought really focuses on this question of how we can best flourish, and even interrogating that notion of what we mean when we say we, and when we talk about what enervates us, what deprives us of that kind of energy, that kind of life force. Alexa Shotwell, who I've also interviewed for this podcast, has this great book Against Purity, where she talks about wanting to sympathize with animals, animal life, frogs in particular, for the sake of the frogs. And I think that's like such a wonderful, expansive framework for thinking about flourishing. And animals themselves, like this is why you're kind of citing examples in biology. They spend a lot of time idling, like they spend a lot of time idle, and
Yeah.
there's a certain kind of beauty to that. How do you think your particular genealogy in the birth of energy can contribute to this like larger discourse, this line of thinking about the relationship between social structures and collective flourishing? Like it is clearly a very timely book. Where do you think it sort of fits in this larger dialogue?
I think I really love that. Before I answer that, I love that you brought up how animals idle a lot, because since the book, I've been thinking a lot about not only the ethic of work and the valorization of work, but also more deeply of dynamism, which I do mention a little in the book, of how just being active and doing things and dynamics, and even the notion of agency or action, which is really prominent even among critical theorists. Um, I think there's this deep commitment to that. And the animal world, I've been reading some biology around just the recognition in the last several decades that a lot of animals are not very active at all. And that's not to say, I mean, every animal species is different. It's just that a lot of the times when we look to biology in political theory to kind of backstop our moral code or ethics, people, have this simplistic reading of evolution. And I talk about this in the book about like the struggle for survival, and a lot of it is that this kind of sense that there's something natural about that. And so I find it so compelling that animal life is actually doesn't accord with that at all. It makes us look a little bit strange. Um, so I do think part of flourishing really will be to think about rethink activity. So it's not just, sometimes a critique of work is about how do we free time for the activities that are meaningful to us, but also what do we want to think about in general, and what we mean by activity. And I think this gets to more specifically your question of where does this fit in maybe to contemporary politics of energy and climate. I do think even among Green New Deals and especially in the field of energy, which is a little bit more captured by technocratic approaches, there's still this very dynamic kind of pro work drive behind it. So it becomes a lot about new infrastructure, replacing fuels, building. It's not to say that there's kind of some sort of need to be categorically against all that, but I think we definitely need to question that. And it concerns me a bit, the scope of some of the Green New Deal thinking and all the building questions that come to play in that it might be reinforcing that drive for dynamism, um, that I think is part of putting us in the position we we are in.
Yeah, I had a question about your kind of reappraisal of this kind of Green New Deal politics, because I think it's an important kind of intervention because it is seen increasingly to be the kind of dominant other modality, the other the alternative to capitalist extractivism is the Green New Deal, and the way that I think you're right, the way that it tends to be marketed is this focus on putting people to work. um, and like Mike Davis, for example, just recently spoke with the Jacobins the Dig podcast, and he talks about how like Biden's strategy of emphasizing that the Green New Deal means jobs actually almost backfired. And I think Davis even kind of misses the point that you make, that we need to think more expansively about well-being, more progressively about the need to go in a radically different direction and maybe provide people with the basic means of taking care of themselves. So Davis is talking just purely about the tactics necessary to win in an election by talking still about jobs. But what you're talking about is that the Green New Deal as a whole, as like a doctrine, as a discourse, is to focus still on like sacrifices. There's this infamous memo, for example, that Green New Deal activists kind of put out that then the Republicans kind of seized upon and translated into this discourse of sacrifice because it underlined the loss of like hamburgers and air travel. Um, like you're posing something different, a kind of politics of pleasure and of freeing time that might resonate more deeply with people. How does this maybe like speak to the need for like a recalibration? You talk in the book about the felt nature of waged work and how that makes it really important politically. Is it too risky to attack the Green New Deal kind of discourse in this way, or is it like a necessary risk in some sense?
Oh, I don't know. I'm so torn about that myself because just to see it become a topic of mainstream conversation and considered even by centrist Democrats is, really important. And I think all of us are really cautious about um, wanting to support that effort while not completely undermining and attacking it. At the same time, it's disheartening, right, to see how the more radical edges get kind of shorn from it. And I do think what you're pointing out is there's something almost self-defeating about it, and this is what concerns me the most, that when we play into this language of jobs um, and economic accounting more broadly, like how much are we going to earn in the how much are we going to grow the economy, and then we're playing into the language of the right, and we're playing on their terrain. And it's very easy then to get into this kind of like micro accounting war. And we already know that we all have different facts and different realities. And I just don't see how that becomes victorious.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm also worried, I think, both strategically and philosophically about this notion of sacrifice and asceticism, because um, I think strategically, you pointed out, I, that we really, I think, give up some of our most powerful arguments, because part of advancing a politics of pleasure, or what is to be gained in terms of well-being, is also that we're not pointing out and really appealing to people about what is hurting right now. What Yes, we might have, there might be, people, especially in the global north, among the wealthiest, who have these benefits of mass kind of cheap consumer goods. But what is the price of that? Not just, I think, of course, we all know the price has been paid and is being paid for centuries by marginalized people, people of color, the global south, and so on, but also by workers, by even, the kind of workers who voted Republican in the last US election. So I think that is important, but I also think philosophically it's important, this kind of politics of pleasure or of sensuality, because that to me is the route towards the kind of recognition of interdependence that we have with the more than human world, is one in which we are affected by it. And so this, like the sacrifice and giving things up, to me puts us more into that anthropocentric framework in which we treat the world as a resource that we either use or don't use.
Mm-hmm. And I know in reading your work on drones that you're invested in Sarah Ahmed's notion of kind of reorientation of queering orientation. That's sort of, it seems to me, what this intervention does is it like takes us out of this familiar route, which is clearly not working, of emphasizing the kind of maybe violence done, the scale of damage in the Anthropocene, right? This tactic of communication is strategically and philosophically faltering in some ways, and so I think this is what I find so kind of and to use this kind of maybe fraught term, empowering about your book, is that you're acknowledging that the scale of damage created by industrialization tests human understanding. And so like that to me is something I wanted to definitely ask you about, is this question of you know not political strategies necessarily, but even strategies of academic or theoretical communication. One of the things that they mention on the energy humanities, or the cultures of energy podcast, is that your text is useful for climate communication because it has all of these really powerful turns of phrase. And your work as a whole has shown this ability to kind of, as it were, go viral. Your work on petromasculinity has this specific kind of usefulness, I think. How do you feel like we can model our communication tactics differently now, knowing that what you call the affective strategy of doom scrolling, of like encouraging this engagement with the difficulty of changing, just it's not effective, it's not really working? Can we use the discourse of interdependence, for example, to suggest an antidote to this kind of like hopelessness, this apathy that seems to reign within the context of what Imre Zeman has called eco-apocalypse discourses?
I do think I have that intention in my work of trying to craft a language that has some strategic or even pragmatic um, application, probably just because I myself have that part of me that's always thinking about how can it work? How can I'm maybe have this still optimistic part of me, that, or hopeful part of me, although honestly, I'm struggling lately to nurture it. But I think because of that, I have since embarking on environmental text and environmental politics at the beginning of my really graduate school career, I've always been turned off by the horror dystopian element. And in some ways, that's personal. I mean, I think for other people, that can be a kind of language that works, that's effective and affective. Um, but I think I had a sense that if for me that was very kind of led to a sort of despair or a feeling of powerlessness or kind of hopelessness, that others might also feel that way too. And I do tend to think that this is kind of in line with Kathy Week's work, that fear leads to a more reactionary politics. And she has a really very complicated notion of hope that I follow, which is not a sort. And I think Sarah Ahmed has similarly a very complicated notion of hope, that it's not this kind of sunny, everything's going to be okay, sheltered privileged position, but that you can operationalize hope as essentially just doing the next right thing, which is my favorite quote from the movie Frozen 2, which I watched with my kids. It's an interesting climate
Hmm.
change movie, by the way. Um, so I I do have a sense that just strategically, um, a language that helps people understand the ways that the world is hurting and the ways that we are, and we is a troubling word, but we are hurting in the ways that others are hurting that are often invisible to privileged people, that all of those things, many of them are part of this system that at the same time might give us these little, addictive kind of dopamine hits. Um, but that doesn't mean there aren't other kinds of well-being, and I think just a lot of humans know that already. And so there's a lot of people who are already working on solidarity, and are already working in mutual aid, and already have this feeling about the world that sometimes is very intimate. And this is maybe where the feminism comes in their intimate relations with others. And I think that there's a receptivity to the notion that well-being, like, I don't think capitalism has captured all of our relationships. So I think if we can really invite people to imagine how those things can be emphasized and expanded, and how we can build communities that foster more of that, I think we've already seen politically that that's very effective with, people like Bernie Sanders.
Absolutely. There is the birth of a kind of political revolution there. It's kind of germinal thing that is about moving away from easy answers, populism, authoritarianism, hypermasculinity. And you mentioned Ahmed's kind of complex relationship to notions of hope. It's definitely something that I'm like really invested in. This chapter that she has in the cultural politics of affect on love is actually like the most depressing chapter in that book, because she's really complicating the idea of love as something that can easily be co-opted, tainted, turned into rage and weaponized. And this is something that comes up in The Birth of Energy, the idea that um, you know doomsday rhetoric can lead to this kind of doubling down. This it can either, as you say, be met with receptivity, which you just referenced, or hostility. It can be met, you say, with rage as much as generosity. And this is because, as you also put it, like grief work can be unappealing, especially when these avoidance tactics are readily available. And it seems to me that one of the things that you're certainly arguing in your article on petromasculinity is that hypermasculinity or compensatory masculinity, reactionary masculinity, is that sort of avoidance tactic, which is such, like, again, I think an important intervention, right? Like it's saying that particular individuals are sheltered by this particular masculine privilege, this love of masculinity. And so I definitely wanted to ask you some questions about that. And in particular, I guess, whether you ever wondered about the sorts of risks that you were taking in identifying westernized hypermasculinity as a target of critique and as a kind of core cause of the unwillingness to accept a move away from productivism. You've talked about the backlash that you received by just identifying toxic masculinity and this weaponized defense of fossil fuel consumption as a problem. Did you at any point kind of not reconsider this particular line of thinking, but sort of again think about tactics, strategy, how to make the argument?
I don't think I expected to be trolled, because I think as an academic, I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel sort of like I'm just writing either into a void or to this, very small audience of people who might be interested and be reading the
Mm-hmm.
same literature. And that's kind of who I picture I'm in conversation with. I don't imagine, or I didn't entertain the fact that there are RSS feeds that are, going through keywords and abstracts
Hmm.
of academic journals precisely to find, you know, publications like mine. And then uh, in a really organized fashion, kind of point targets at different academics and public intellectuals and journalists who are doing this kind of work. Um, so I think both it surprised me that there would be this kind of bigger visibility or broader um, uh, reception. On the other hand, I have since, once it happened to me, I then, of course, became really noticed and became interested in other people that it has happened to. And I've started to realize this is a very common um, new phenomenon. And I think we're still coming to terms with the psychological and emotional burden of that. I think especially for journalists who are writing frequently and really are more addressing a popular
Hmm.
audience. But and a lot of feminists have faced this. Yeah, so in some ways, at first I felt like, why
Hmm.
me? But now I've realized, oh, I'm just this little part of this very big and scary trend. And I think it's important to recognize and to talk. I've been talking more about it because I think I felt very alone. Like I didn't know anyone who had been through that. But I think because it is happening more and more, it will be important for graduate students and other academics to know that this could happen and to have an idea of what they can do about it, and which I
Yeah,
didn't.
I agree, right? That, as Ahmed says, we need to kind of support those that make these kinds of complaints publicly. And there are so many examples, as you say, it's actually quite common. And the backlash is some indication that you're actually gaining traction, that it's working. But there is definitely a psychological and emotional burden. And, there is this whole history of the corporate use of public relations to discredit everyone from climate researchers to people who, journalists who write about the prevalence of CTE, brain injuries in sport, right? Like, to really try and defame them because of the potential that their intervention might matter. And animal activists as well face this level of backlash and put their lives on the line. Um, and I wanted to actually relate it to something that you write about in your drone disorientations essay. You say flatly in that essay that it would help to emphasize drone disorientations by continuing to make drone things and bodies appear in public. And it just seems to me that that's a really prescient line. Like, we obviously need a kind of reckoning around the use of drones to kill people remotely, and this is what the article does. And I can see it being really useful in the context of teaching, where it's hard to flesh it out in a way that actually makes it resonate. It's just such a completely foreign idea, but you in linking it to masculinity, and in particular hypermasculinity, do the work of trying to make it clear to people why they should maybe think about this, the reality of killing people remotely. And I guess I wanted to ask why you were interested in examining drone warfare, and whether you do feel like making it public undermines some key element of the kind of distance that drones provide. Like, how does exposing these narratives undermine, like, narratives of actually having to do it and live with the grief? How does that undermine this ideology of clean combat?
Yeah, I think it does broadly connect to what it means. What is the function of violence, both politically and also psychologically? What is its effect? And um, in the petromasculinity piece, I used Kate Mann's new idea about how to think about misogyny as a policing tactic, as the punishing force that comes down on bodies that are out of line. And so, in that sense, it really thinks about violence as having a function of upholding relations of power. But we all know, people who are working in ecological politics, that one of the hard things to grapple with is sort of Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence. Violence that is not only slow, so it's not very spectacular, it's easy to miss, or to not have to be responsible or accountable for it when you are complicit in exercising it, but also the way that violence can be subterranean, can be made invisible to privileged people. Um, so there's this continuum of violence in which sometimes it is really about the performativity and the spectacular nature of it as having both a political function in terms of upholding power, but also this kind of political psychological function of upholding certain kinds of hypermasculinity, for example, in killing and war. But then there's also these other kinds of violence that are really important to consider, and that need to be made invisible, especially to privileged people, to again grease the wheels of how power is upheld and circulates. And so I think my interest in drones was coming from it in that way, that it is hidden from, for example, U.S. citizens, and yet we have this uber patriotism of celebrating the military. But if you looked at actual narratives of people, they're hard to find, but if you and they're purposefully hard to find, but if you looked at narratives from people who had been drone operators, you saw something really complicated about the toll that kind of violence took, that it wasn't necessarily clean, like you said. That's not to sort of put all of our pity or sympathy with drone operators, but rather to help us to just think more about drone warfare, like you said, to just make it public, but also to recognize the way that violence is in a relationship with masculinity, and what kinds of violence, in terms of its spectacular nature or its performative nature, is seen as properly feeding that kind of
Wow,
masculinity.
there's a lot to unpack there. But I immediately think about the fact that during this lame duck phase of Trump's presidency, he's decided to reinstate the death penalty and execute a number of people, right? Among them, Lisa Montgomery. I think she's the first woman who will be executed in something like 70 years. Like there's a way in which, in particular, legalizing spectacular forms of putting prisoners to death, so firing squad, poison gas, electrocution, are certainly, I think, serve the purpose of insisting that Trump is a law and order president, right? This kind of almost misogynistic policing tactic of upholding the relationship of the sovereign to those that have committed crimes. I immediately think about that. And certainly, in your article on petromasculinity, Trump is a key figure. He's a kind of exemplum of petromasculinity. And for that reason, I think in part, Gizmodo, in citing your article, employs images of Trump in like a big rig, and Trump supporters in their trucks, like shutting down key traffic arteries, bridges, and so on. This is why I think your work is really valuable. It kind of crystallizes the links between these different forms of violence. And in particular, the link between fossil fuels and violence obviously is what you're talking about here. What you term a kind of disastrous convergence of gender and energy. Even though the links to me are really painfully clear, you note the fact that it's something that is kind of understudied. Why do you think that's the case? Like, why is there some entrenched logic that makes it really difficult to expose this fundamental element of petrocultures, that they are rooted in a certain kind of hyper masculinity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've had a couple colleagues who have worked more in spaces where they've been with energy policymakers and um, more sort of institution type work, and have commented on how it is sometimes easy to bring up gender now. There's been a gender mainstreaming. And of course, when we bring up gender, we're talking about, oh, women's issues and can women have energy and women's representation. And those things have become easier to talk about. But it's very difficult to talk about men and
Mm-hmm.
masculinity still. And I think I found that in the first time I wrote about, really, well, yeah, this kind of petromasculinity piece touched a nerve. I think partly it's that in general feminism does get marginalized and dismissed. So there has been just generations of work in ecofeminism connecting gender masculinity and ecological violence. And even for me as a scholar, when I was in graduate school, I remember several senior faculty dismissive of ecofeminism, and in a way that kind of made it took me more time to come to it myself because of those comments, and dismissive of them, like, oh well, those are just the people who say mother nature, and they're essentialist about gender, these kind of offhand
Mm-hmm.
comments. Whereas other fields where there may have been theorists who um, made arguments that are no longer fashionable, that's not a reason to dismiss an entire field. So I think in part, it's not necessarily understudied, it's more that it's marginalized. I think it's more obvious now to more people, because of that notion of hypermasculinity, which is a term I take from Anna Agathondolu and Lily Ling, who are two feminist scholars in international relations. And they use the term hypermasculinity to talk about a mode of masculinity that's
Mm-hmm.
under threat, and that has this extreme reactionary response to a felt impotence and a felt kind of crisis around a masculine identity that is increasingly difficult to maintain and under threat. And so it's easier to recognize that that's a much more explosive, performative and spectacular kind of masculinity, that we all can just see every day now, like you said, with the trucks and and just Trump, really. So that might explain why it may have been
Mm-hmm.
more subtle
Yeah,
before.
I think you're definitely right that there is something that is like really valuable about talking about hypermasculinity in relationship to burning fossil fuels, in the sense that, as you say in your article, we now experience burning fossil fuels as a knowingly violent experience. The links are too strong to not experience it as that kind of like knowingly violent act. And so, you know, reasserting what you call white masculine power is this kind of way of just leaning into that act of knowingly doing violence to the planet. Like you can kind of exonerate yourself by just making it a question of inhabiting a habit of being. I really appreciate that, that sort of whole line of thinking, which I think, because of the risk that it takes in some sense of like courting this fragile reactionary backlash, gets the conversation moving in a productive direction.
Yeah, I think that there are real strategic consequences to seeing that, because already the need to address fossil fuels as a kind of power that has to be overthrown, and not just as a technology that's going to fade away once other technologies are superior. Already that is not as common as it should be. But it is easier to push for that, to push for an anti-fossil fuel politics when you start to recognize that there's not just a purely rational set of demands around using fossil fuels, that it has there are now movements that are accelerating and intensifying fossil fuel use, I think precisely because it is a way of demonstrating that this kind of white masculine power can be maintained and is resilient. It's symbolic. And that's not only why fossil fuels are being burned. I think, honestly, largely we know it's because it represents trillions of dollars
Mm-hmm.
of profit. But politically, that's not how they are being operationalized in terms of movement building on the far right.
And on that point, I think, I wanted to ask about the response to COVID-19. I wanted to ask you in particular, because you are a theorist of work, how COVID-19 has disrupted work patterns and ways of thinking about work. I mean, there's a way in which, for example, forms of work that have been, in some sense, feminized, forms of affective labor, care labor, are now lionized. The pandemic, this unprecedented moment, is also, making us think about how particular people who we weren't thinking about, who occupied spaces of ignored labor, now are putting their lives on the line. Right? It's sort of changing our relationship to work in specific ways. Amazon employees, for example, and the miles and miles that they walk in warehouses are now not invisibilized forms of labor, but have become a little bit more, I think, visible. You talk in the book about this maneuver of hiding waste through screens that denies the value of certain forms of labor. Do you see a kind of potential for, a kind of, what you term a kind of threatening insurgent economy and ecology of work, that just makes visible how essential these kinds of workers are?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that. I was listening to NPR and they were talking about how the CDC and others are going to roll out a vaccine, and that essential workers are being considered as early in line for a vaccine. And how do you define an essential worker?
Hmm.
And I thought, well, that's going to be an interesting conversation. And I bet there's not going to be a lot of, critical theorists in the room to help with that. So yeah, I think you're right that in that sense, people are starting to think about or see or realize their dependence upon all these kinds of labor, especially intimate kinds of labor. Like you saw in the spring all these articles about, is it safe to have my nanny come? Is it safe to have the house cleaner? All these people who are really intimately involved in the lives, especially of privileged Americans, and don't often have any kind of protection of their job, of benefits, maybe even of citizenship. So maybe there's some I think there are certainly possibilities there for building more worker movements on the basis of that. Mostly, I'm, especially in the last few months, feeling more disheartened to see the constant repetition of the economy versus health.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, when I started to hear this this binary, I thought, well, this is brilliant because it's really such a remarkable illustration of how the economy, as it's conceived by capitalism, is really not is really not serving people's well-being, and actually is directly opposed to it. But instead of, instead of people, I think, reflecting on that in a critical way, it's almost like an acceptance of that. And I don't think it's confined to the right either, that it feels like people have just accepted that there's this collateral damage necessary to keep the economy going. And even, with the CDC reconsidering its quarantine length, I heard some of the scientists say, well, the main reason is because people don't want to miss work to take a test, because they're afraid if they take a test, they're going to lose their job if they have to quarantine for 2 weeks, or they're going to go without pay and not be able to feed their families. And what frustrates me is nowhere on the table that I've seen, in kind of on NPR, in the newspapers, do people think, well, how about we guarantee people have sick leave? How about we guarantee benefits for them?
Mm-hmm.
It's like the public imagination just kind of stops at that point. Well, I guess we need to make quarantine shorter. So that's a little frustrating for me, because I do think you're right that it's made this visible, really visible, that the economy is in opposition to our well-being. And yet I don't really see yet, maybe it just hasn't come yet. I don't really see even the ability to imagine what could be different.
Yeah, and it seems like there is this kind of, irreducible remainder or something that is, almost, perceived as transhistorical. And in your book, you talk about this to some extent, like on page 10 of Birth of Energy, you talk about the issues with naming the human species as the problem. The humans seem to crave ever more energy. Like there is this line of thinking that is so essentialist that doesn't seem to allow for any sort of transformative thinking on a post-work future, ways of being otherwise. What do you think is valuable, I guess, about the historical approach that you take? And do you think that this is maybe missing in the discourse around COVID-19? I mean, that energy work connection is not really being fundamentally questioned. Do we need to read more Ahmed? Like, do we need to really, engage with how to, rupture productivism's hegemonic place in our lives? And how do you just tactically make that something that people can understand?
Well, yes, everyone should read more Ahmed. Tactically, I do think that really uh, policies that address people's just basic needs and ability to have dignity in their lives, in their housing, in their food, in their families are important. So, I'm encouraged even by, I've seen how the idea of forgiving student debt is being considered. Of course, it gets watered down and watered down and watered down, and who knows if what version of it might actually ever pass. But people are talking about that in terms of COVID. Like, well, this could actually be, if we're talking about economic recovery, how about freeing up loan payments for all of these people who could then use that to go buy food and put that directly into the quote unquote economy. um, so, sometimes I do think, as much as I get, when we all get depressed about the current moment, it's important to recognize that there are these movements that have been working for years. Black Lives Matter. I think the debt movement grew out of David Graeber's work in Occupy Wall Street. Years of work on the ground to build these ideas that at first feel incredibly radical and almost impossible, but that when the time is ripe and after so much work to kind of extend it and build communities around these ideas, they they emerge and can be considered. So, just because I guess I'll correct myself, just because right now no one is imaginatively reconsidering how we could not oppose the economy to well-being, doesn't mean that maybe that won't be something that bubbles up in the future. But yeah, I think in my book, that's why I kind of mention Kathy Weeks in her book talks about universal basic income and shorter working week, not as like the end of a utopian vision and that's everything will be great once that happens, but really as kind of levers that open up new possibilities, new ways of being, new paths for people to start to have enough um, security in their everyday life um, to be able to pose these questions to their communities about well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually going to be talking to Kathy Weeks this weekend for the podcast. So
Oh, that's so exciting.
yeah, and I think yeah, the fact of emphasizing basic needs, you know, is a really important ground for politics, and food in particular. You mentioned food is such a unifying kind of issue, and on this question of food, you know, I wonder about because you know there is this way in which like we have a privileged position to some extent, you know, and you do talk about how the kind of rhythm of a writer's life is different from you know the kind of you know waged labor that's become hegemonic. It's a kind of vestige of a previous model of work to some extent, but you know I think nonetheless you know there is like I'm kind of joining a lot of different things together, like the fact of you know the way we eat, how certain people have to you know eat on the fly, eat on the job, eat in their cars, you know, do the keto diet in order to make their food work harder. These kinds of things, you know, in the context of intellectual labor, you know, we often exist in spaces that are conducive to slow food, and there's this kind of you know radical politics of trying to experience food in this kind of almost spiritual way. But I guess the last question I want to ask you is this question about the work life balance, perhaps of you know intellectual laborers. You know, there is this notion in autonomous Marxist philosophy that intellectual labor, the creative class, is something that Marx didn't precisely anticipate, and that you know it's something that destabilizes what you call the use of work-life balance as a tactic of governance. Like it really messes with that to some extent and makes the distinction between work and labor and free time kind of indistinct. Where are you at in terms of your own relationship to the work that you do? You know, like in preparing for this podcast, for example, I made the choice to write questions out by hand, even though I knew that that wasn't the most efficient way to do the work, because I find that slower tactile process just makes me more happy in my work. And I just made that kind of decision. Do you often have to do this kind of cost benefit analysis when it comes to your own professional commitments? I mean, you've chosen to do this, so that's generous of you. Like, how do you basically manage your time? I guess is in part my question.
Yeah. I'm sure you've seen the slow academia. Um,
Hmm.
and I'm forgetting who is behind that, but you know, yeah, you're right. We have this model of intellectual life that feels very much out of temporal rhythm with waged work. And yet, especially in the US, and I know also in the UK, and maybe even globally, that higher education is increasingly corporatized and ne- following a neoliberal model that's asking us to account for ourselves, you know, by metrics um, and wants to kind of turn academia into a more familiar job. And for me personally, having kids has kind of forced a slow
Yeah,
academic
same.
pace because I have never really had any support from any university I was at in terms of like paid leave, or subsidies for childcare. Um, so I guess with the exception, ironically, of this COVID time. Well, not even that. I mean, we'll see. Our university is talking about it, but so far I'm using a research leave that I was granted, which happened to fall right now. And essentially, that's going to be most of that time is going to be used for teaching my kids who are home a lot. So, um, for me personally, I have always felt like I really, my dream in life is to be a writer. And if money were no object, I think I would just be writing all the time. But I do get a lot out of students too. It's maybe not my passion, but I actually think it's really important to helping me be a better thinker. So that part is important. But I've told myself to try to approach academia and the whole tenure track and all the pressure always like, um, this is something that I could walk away from if it drains all the joy out of it. And therefore I feel like it's a constant fight, and it's probably something just in my head, but there's a lot, that's constantly telling us to be busy, 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 and productive, productive, productive. And that's very counter to thinking like it took me almost 10 years to write this book. Of course, I had babies along the way, but when I think about that pace, it sometimes takes, you can't just sit down and have an idea. There's a lot of even sort of dead time where you're just daydreaming and nothing happens. And it's hard not to feel guilty at the end of just, I read like four things and don't know what else happened. It's hard not to feel like, well, I didn't do anything.
Hmm.
I try to remind myself that um, that is the nature of just thinking and curiosity. And we have to have time for idleness and procrastination and daydreaming. And how do you make that time? I don't know. It feels like one of my advisors told me, oh, that's what you do in the summer and on the breaks. I'm just like, no, in the summer, I'm taking care of my kids.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think it's a constant struggle. I'm always reminding myself it's a privileged position to be in, to even have a secure job. And of course, that's the stick that's wielded, right? Is if you're not productive enough, it won't end up being a secure job. So I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. I mean, what do you do?
Oh, I'm still figuring it out as well. But I will say, as a person who makes their living, as it were, working with ideas, have to kind of balance, as you say, these professional compulsions and commitments with some kernel of something that was like spontaneous in you, that thinks that these things matter, that we should care about them. Like, this is why I care about your work, is that it is a critique of the structure itself, and I sense that you are vexed in a sense by the structures that you're working within, and the limits that are placed on our ability to imagine ways to go in a different direction. I mean, Ahmed has this wonderful idea in What's the Use of, the kind of double notion of resignation. That resignation can be a matter of resigning yourself to the conditions under which you work, but it's as much about removing yourself from the conditions of work, right? You can resign, you can walk away, as you say. And I think there is something to be said for, emphasizing the doubleness of that idea of resignation. That we don't have to leave, but we do have to carve out some degree of autonomy against the, constant demands on us, the threat of insecurity that's posed to us. But yeah, it's been fantastic talking to you.
Oh, it's so nice to talk to you. You're such a generous interviewer. I really appreciate all the handwritten work that you put in.
Mhm. Yeah, no problem. The podcast has really been about kind of increasing my drive to not just look at academic work as something that is static, but it dawned on me that I can actually contact people who produce this work and talk to them. you know.
You know, it's funny because I think I'm realizing myself, I have some kind of celebrity complex,
Right.
like people who write before I wrote much myself. It's like if somebody wrote a book, then like they're not a real person. Like I've never written Kathy Weeks, and she's so important to my work.
If you have any questions, I'll share them with her. This would be maybe a new segment on the podcast. Do you have any questions for my next guest?
Well, I do. I mean, she doesn't really mention the environment, which is fine. She's doing quite a lot in that book, and that's not at all a critique. But I, was interested in how environmental movements do think about anti-work as important, and I would just wonder what she thought of that.
I'll definitely ask her. Well, thanks, Cara, for your time.
Thanks for your time. Okay.